God of grace and of love, of baptism and holy communion, we give you thanks for your continued presence in our lives. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart here this day be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Well, my friends, this week we continue our Power of Women series, uplifting our women and looking at some of our powerful women examples. This series began a few weeks ago, kicked off by our very own Margaret Borelli, who is joining us here this day. Today we have before us two very powerful women. We have a judge and we have a queen. Now, Deborah was the only female judge of God's people before the time of the kings. And Esther, as we have learned, was queen of Persia, one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. Let's start with Deborah. Now, Deborah ruled during a very turbulent time for God's people. Moses and Joshua had led and finally gotten the people to the promised land. But it would still be a very long time before Saul and David and Solomon established a monarchy in Israel. This middle period in Israel's history was led by the judges. And hence our book of Judges recounts many of those stories. These judges were administrators, they were warriors, they were leaders. And like many of our powerful women, when we tell Deborah's story, or I should say when Deborah's story is often told, it is told with her as a supporting character, rather than with her being the main actor in her own story. Now, the other day, I read a story about a young woman in the journey of her own faith. She was sharing with her friends and her colleagues how excited she was to be filled by God and that God was empowering her to pursue so many different ministries, both in her and through her, in the work of her life. And sharing this joyous story, she finished by saying, "It is just sad to think that God is having to use me because a man somewhere has failed." Now the story goes on, and she was questioned about what she meant. And the young woman answered, she said, "God wanted a godly man to lead, but God chose me as plan B. I'm glad that God is using me, but it makes me feel very badly that someone else has failed." Now, this very sad logic is often how many people think of Deborah. And rather than taking the truth that is told in the story in Judges 4 and Judges 5, some people put their own bias into this story and think that because her general, Barak, was unwilling or unafraid, or afraid, to lead the troops in the battle without her being there by his side, that means God had to pass over him to lift her up, that she was plan B. So they take this story that is about God's empowering women, that is about God's trust in women, and make it about a man. Now the truth about Deborah is that she trusted in our God. God had appointed Deborah as judge of Israel and as a prophet to the people. Now there had been other judges before her, and all of them had been men. Our Bible stories, particularly in Judges, repeatedly tell us that the people continued to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They worshiped false gods. They did not keep the laws of Moses. According to Judges 5:31, everything in the land was pretty much going south until you arose, Deborah, as a mother in Israel. During this time, God raised up Deborah to lead God's people back to their faith. Not as plan B, but as plan A. And in her role as prophet, Deborah even proclaimed that it would be a woman who would deliver God's people. just as thousands of years later, it would be a woman who first proclaimed that Christ is risen. Now, God not only lifted up Deborah, God lifts up and empowers all women, all of our women, all the women of this world. Our Bible tells us that Deborah was not afraid to fight, not afraid to rule, because she trusted that God would be with her, that God would remain by her side. And that trust in God is something that she shared in common with Queen Esther. Because Esther also had a deep and abiding trust in God. And in our modern language, we can definitely look at Esther as kind of a rags to riches story. I mean, she grew up as an orphan, living in a foreign land, being raised by her uncle. And she ended up being the queen of the empire. Her story, though, Esther's story, begins with a different woman. It begins with the first Persian queen, whose name is Vashti. Queen Vashti is objectified and humiliated by the king when he orders her to parade around for her guests, so everyone can see how beautiful his wife is. She refuses his harassment. But there is a price. In her refusal, she's stripped of her queenship, and she disappears into the pages of history. Now, in a recent study among working-age women in the United States, most said they often do not ask for pay raises as often as their male counterparts because they do not want to face any negative consequences. So there's a power dynamic that is going on that has set up a gendered pay scale in our country where most men make more than most women who do the exact same jobs. And we can trace this as far back, at least as far back, to Queen Vashti. When a woman refuses to give in to a powerful man, there are sometimes unpleasant consequences that follow. And through the centuries, we, the church and society, have burdened our women with working through this on their own, rather than as a community to confront the roots of the problem. And now Esther, she was a woman who found her own workaround. With the help of God, she saved her people from death. With the help of God, she was raised up and honored and continues to teach us that trust in our God will lead to our deliverance. Now, Esther, of course, like all of us, was a flawed human being. She did not follow all of the religious laws that had been set down by Moses, but neither did the future kings. Saul disobeyed God. David was a murderer. Solomon was an idolater. But God worked through these men to accomplish God's righteous goals. And God does the exact same thing with Esther. We learn in our story that there was even a time in her life where she had to hide her Jewish identity for her own safety. But through her faith and her trust in God, she comes out of the closet and declares, proclaims that she is a Jew. She speaks her own truth. Now, even living in a pagan country so far away from her homeland, she is able, with God's trust and God's help, to proclaim her humanity and to fully embrace who she is as a child of God. And in this proclamation, is she rejected? No, quite the opposite. She is fully accepted and recognized as the person who will deliver God's people. Now, in both of these stories, we are told that neither Deborah nor Esther had any fear because each of them trusted in God completely. Now, that sounds noble. That sounds wonderful. I personally have a bit of a hard time with that. They were, after all, women living in a patriarchal society. Their voices rarely mattered. So I think when our Bible tells us that neither of them had any fear, The lessons that we are to learn is that they did not fear that God's presence, that God's Holy Spirit would always be with them. And this distinction is important. And the reason that this distinction is important, because in today's world, we cannot let our women and girls think that if they have fear, that they are not loved by God, that they are not worthy of God's love. God traveled with Deborah and with Esther. And God travels with all of our women today. Now I'm going to give each of you a little homework. Yay, we're in school, right? A pretty easy assignment, but I think something that will be very powerful for both you and the person who hears your words. At some point during this week to come, I want each of you to tell a woman in your life that her voice matters. Or sometime in this week to come, I want you to show a woman in your life that you value her opinion. And at some point in this week to come, I want you to remind a woman in your life that she is a special and unique creation of our God. May it be so. Now, my friends, at this time in our worship, we're going to lift up our communal joys and concerns. If you have prayers that Rodney's going to come up and bring our microphone from. If you have prayers you would like to share with our community, I ask you to rise in body and spirit as you are able. Say your name into the microphone and then your prayer so that we can all pray for you in the days to come. I would like, as Rodney's taking the microphone, I would like to mention Grace Green, who has been moved to the Welsh home, where she is recovering. She's having some back issues, to keep her in your prayers. And Janet Gorman has also been moved. She is now in a long-term room, which is room A13. A13 at O'Neill's Healthcare in Bradley Bay.
I've known Leslie 18 years. We've stood together for 18 years.
Okay. Any other prayers for our community will be good for you.
Brian Rochek, just prayers for Rochek family. My grandmother, who I looked it up last week, she ended up passing on Tuesday. Services were Thursday, so thank you for the kind words and prayers that were sent, and I think that we continue. Thank you.
My friends, I invite you to turn to God and lift out the prayers in your heart that you may not be able to form the words to speak. Let us spend a moment of prayer.